Brexit Britain should embrace the Commonwealth and look to forge new bonds at the conclusion of the EU transition period, a leading political commentator has said, as he warns the EU may not survive the coronavirus pandemic. Boris Johnson's government has so far refused to extend the Brexit transition period beyond December 31, and has vowed to thrash out a trade deal with the EU by the end of the year, despite the coronavirus pandemic. One political commentator has suggested the move to continue negotiations is necessary, as he warns there may not be an EU at the end of the outbreak. Jonathan Saxty, assistant editor of Brexit-Watch.org, pointed to the current infighting between European member states and instead urged the government to pursue an official union with Commonwealth countries. Mr. Saxty suggested the time had come for CANZAC, the movement to unite Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Writing in the Daily Telegraph, he said, at a time when the UK has extricated itself from the EU, the case for CANZAC has never been greater. He suggested the world might be a very different place after coronavirus, and said bold ideas, such as CANZAC, may be needed to rejuvenate and renew. He added, tomorrow's world will be one in which we need to rebuild where alliances already exists, with complementary economies and geopolitical scope. When the charred remains of the world economy are laid bare, we may find a very different landscape. This won't be a time for business as usual. It will be a time to go big or go home. The Brexiteer said it was fortunate the UK had already committed to leaving the EU, as the bloc is currently riddled with Mr. Saxty wrote, today, we are seeing the EU's united front disintegrate before our eyes, as Italy and Spain in particular are ravaged by COVID-19. Those arguing for delaying the end of transition for Britain leaving the UK ought to consider whether there will actually be an EU at the end of this. The coronavirus crisis has exposed the limits of European solidarity. Why have the trappings of a state, a common currency, central bank, parliament, flag and anthem, not to mention talk of a common military, if you are not going to behave like one? Instead, Mr. Saxty urged the UK to leave behind its past EU ties and look to forge a new bond with the Commonwealth, particularly CANZAC countries. He said, we ought to realize the only countries which should contemplate moving in together are countries which have these are bonds which transcend transient economic considerations, the very characteristics which the CANZAC countries share. The commentator does not suggest the group should entirely mimic the EU and said things like a shared currency and mandatory laws would not be necessary. Instead, Mr. Saxty suggested CANZAC should unite in areas where size and global reach matter. The Brexiteer claimed CANZAC would be unrivaled, due to the trust and bonds that exist between the countries. He said, for CANZAC, the idea of four countries which span roughly 12% of the world's land surface, and which share a head of state, language, legal system and, above all, trust, uniting on defense, geopolitics, and other areas where scale matters,